So now we have this log. We've kind of shaped it a little bit, but the trick is now how do we get this block of color and pattern into a finished object? And that's what we're going to zip through right now. So it's not really dissimilar to what we did with the stripes. With the stripes, we turned it into a slab, and that will become a finished object. And we're going to do the same thing here with this little patterned block of clay. I shrunk it down even a little bit more so we can, kind of see how tight that pattern can become. Now what we're going to do is, as I promised, we're going to continue to slice across the grain. So we slice these little miniature slabs off the end of this block of clay, and we're going to need a lot of them. And so we just keep slicing. Now, the slicing is pretty critical because if you want your piece to be very thin, and in this case, translucent, you have to slice these little slices very thinly because that black clay that outlines the pattern is also always opaque. You can't have black stain and translucency at the same time. The black is always opaque. So the challenge is to keep that black line essentially running directly through the clay. The only way to do that is to make sure that that little clay slab is very thin, because if it's thick, if it's, even 1/8 of an inch thick, when you go to roll it thin, that black slab will slide, and any place that black is, it's going to be opaque. So if you want the piece to be thin and translucent, you're going to have to slice these off as thin as you possibly can slice them. Now, if you don't care about translucency, life gets much easier. You can slice it as thick as you want, because if you're not concerned about the translucency potential, all you'll then have to worry about is the surface, and the surface will be fine as long as you scrape off any smearing that happens. So I just keep slicing away, slicing. And as I said earlier, I said this is not tedious anymore to me, this is fascinating to me, but it might be a little tedious to watch. So I went ahead and did a little jump start on this, and there's a bunch of sliced versions ready to go. So now we've got that ready to go. All I really need to do is start to construct these little pieces, bits and pieces, into a finished slab. And this is the form that I'm going to be using when I'm all done. This is what I want these pieces to fill. I've done this 1,000 times, so I know pretty much what that shape is going to look like. But if you haven't done it 1,000 times, this is the little measuring device that I constructed to measure the interior shape of this object. And this is just a piece of floral wire. I use it because it's nice and easy to bend. And all I do is I want to measure the distance from here to here. And I do that by laying it in there. And then I mark it, just as I've marked it there. So now I know that from this top edge down to the very center of the bottom is about that distance right there. And then I want to know essentially what half of this circumference is. So I measure that, and then I mark that point. So now, if I couldn't visualize it, now I know the measurements, and all I have to do is then transfer those measurements over here onto this piece of fabric. That's the circumference, and this is the height. And now I can draw that in. And so this is the slab that I'm going to want to construct to go inside that form. And I'll need 2 of them because I'm only doing half of the piece. So I need 2 of them. They're both about the same size. That's what I'm going to fill. And then I just start filling away. And it's not too complicated. You want maybe a little bit of overlap, but not too much. This clay is somewhat sticky, which is good. You want a clay that's a little sticky. It's not really that wet anymore, but it's sticky enough so that it will work. And all I'm going to do is lay these side by side. Again, you can overlap them a little bit if you want, but I wouldn't overlap too much. If you overlap too much, any place you have an overlap, it's going to smear and spread and distort the pattern that you're trying to generate. So pretty much you want to put them, just kind of butt them together, not overlap them. Now you probably have noticed that by stretching this down, making it thinner on one end and thicker on the other end, I have created a little situation where when it's all done, the interior of the piece, the bottom of the piece, is going to be smaller than the top edge. And that's not a mistake, that was intentional. And I did it because I like that kind of, that sense of movement that happens when you go from small to large. It's certainly not mandatory, but it's a technique that I use repeatedly. If you think back to the stripes, comes as no surprise I did the same thing with the stripes. I had the bottom of the stripe smaller and the top of the stripe larger. So we're just piecing together. It's obviously a little larger than the shape I need, because I'm going to cut away some of the edge. I was pretty close in my estimate. Not perfect, so we'll have to come over, slice a little more off. So now I've got this pretty much laid out the way I want it to look. All I have to do now is roll it. But first, before I roll it, I'm going to spritz it a little bit. Again, these are just butt joined together. There's very little overlap. So, you know, it's going to be critical that I get enough moisture on here to stick this thing together. So I give it a spritz, not too wet because it gets messy. Being messy at this point is not the end of the world, because I can scrape it clean later on, but if it's not, you know, no reason to make it messier than I need at this point. Unlike when I was constructing this roll where the mess didn't matter at all, now it does start to matter because you're going to be able to see it. And I'm pushing down. I do have to apply some pressure because I need to kind of mush those different joints together. It's a little insignificant maybe detail, but I have a rolling pin. I took the ends off because as I'm doing this, I get a much better feel for how much pressure I'm applying if I'm pushing directly down onto the clay. If I have you know, the handles on there, I just can't feel it as well. So I take the handles off on this rolling pin and just use the direct pressure. And then I pull it off, and you can see it's starting to join together. Seams are closing up, so I have to really look and see that I'm getting them all. And I'm going to flip it over, check the other side. Now I'm looking at it and I can see that there's, you know, some problems here, there's some problems there. These are not insurmountable problems. These are relatively easy to fix, and I'm going to fix them by just continuing to roll that clay a little bit. I haven't really talked much about working thin. I have been working thin because that's just my default, that's what I do. But I haven't really talked about it because it's not particularly relevant to the topic of colored clays. But, you know, I'll just mention it. When I'm working thin like this, I really can put a lot of pressure on this clay because it's thin. And I mean, I can push down real hard, and there is a subtle benefit there because by being able to push down so hard on the clay, I really am sealing those joints together. If the clay was thicker, if I was working with clay that was, you know, maybe 1/4 of an inch thick, I probably would have to be just a little more cautious about getting those joints pushed together real tightly before I started rolling, because I couldn't apply as much pressure as I can when I'm working real thin like this. But that is basically now the unit that I've got to work with. Again, it's not the shape I want, so I would come back and maybe make a few modifications to it to keep it within the confines of the piece that I want. So this now will become pretty much half of the finished piece that I'm trying to accomplish. And there we go, that's what I was after.